Two innocent Florida men convicted for murders they didn't commit. They didn't know each other, and their crimes didn't seem connected until both of their connections were overturned and one man was charged with both of their crimes. A serial killer was allowed to continue his killing spree, while two innocent men were put in prison and spent decades behind bars. Welcome back to True Crime Unchained. I'm Tim, filming from Southwest Florida, and tonight's story is about one of the most disturbing failures in Florida crime history. It connects Frank Lee Smith, Jerry Frank Townsend, and Eddie Lee Mosley. Two of these men were wrongfully convicted, while one predator kept moving through the shadows. And while the system was busy punishing the wrong people, this violence just kept unfolding. This isn't just a wrongful conviction story. This is a story about a serial predator with a long, horrifying trail, and about how the justice system kept missing him while innocent men paid the price. Broward County, specifically northwest Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in the 1970s and 80s, was a place where fear spread fast. There were sexual assaults, strangulations, murders, and frightened communities were desperate for answers. The pressure on police was enormous. And when that happens, investigations can start moving in the wrong direction. Instead of following evidence wherever it leads, investigators can lock onto a suspect and then build a case around that person. Once that happens, every statement and every piece of information gets filtered through that assumption. And that's the dangerous backdrop for these cases. Because, when the wrong man becomes the answer, the real killer just gets more time. Frank Lee Smith was convicted in 1986 for the rape and murder of 8-year-old Chandra Whitehead. He was sentenced to death. The case against him leaned heavily on testimony, and as time went on, the foundation of that conviction became more and more questionable. This wasn't just a case that rested on solid, unshakable physical proof. It was a kind of case that can look like persuasive in the moment, but collapse later when you examine it carefully. Frank never got a chance to prove his innocence while he was alive. He died of cancer on death row before the official exoneration came through. He died at the age of 56, and his exoneration would come just 11 months after his death. The DNA evidence pointed away from Frank Smith and toward Eddie Lee Mosley. So that means that Frank wasn't just convicted, he was wrongfully condemned for a murder he did not commit. Jerry Frank Townsend's story, just as heartbreaking. See, Townsend had intellectual disabilities, and that made him especially vulnerable to pressure, confusion, and bad police work. He was convicted of multiple murders and a rape in South Florida, and the case against him was shaped by flawed investigative methods and weak assumptions. This is where the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. A vulnerable man was taken into a system that, let's be honest, it should have protected him. Instead, they said, hey, look, we got a convenient answer right here. So Townsend spent more than 20 years in prison before DNA testing proved he wasn't the killer. He was released on January 15th, 2001, but not before losing decades of his life. He received over $4 million in compensation from the state of Florida and Broward County. And yes, that compensation came from local government money, which means taxpayers were on the hook for at least part of the cost. And once again, the DNA evidence pointed back to Eddie Lee Mosley. Now let's talk about Mosley, because this is where the story really, truly becomes chilling. What follows is the broader timeline of the violence tied to him, and it helps explain just how long he was operating while the wrong men were locked up. So from November 1971 through July 1973, nearly 150 rapes were reported in northwest Fort Lauderdale. Victims described a tall black man with a scar on his left cheek who choked and raped them in isolated areas. Mosley was the prime suspect during this wave of attacks. By early 1973, he was also suspected in the rape and murders of at least 2 black girls. On July 9, 1973, Vetta Turner, 34, was raped and strangled. DNA later confirmed Mosley's connection. On July 23, 1973, Mosley was arrested after 3 rape victims identified him. More than 40 women later identified him from photographs. He was charged with sexual battery, but he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to the Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee for about 5 years. So, believe it or not, during that institutional period, the rapes and murders dropped sharply. Then we get into what we'll call the post-release surge. Mosley was released in summer 1979 after a transfer to South Florida State Hospital. And then the violence surged again. In July 1979, Sonia Yvette Marion, 13, was raped and murdered. DNA later confirmed Mosley. In August 1979, Terry Jean Cummings, 21, was raped and murdered. DNA later confirmed Mosley. In 1979, other young black women were raped and strangled near his home. At least 7 murders occurred in roughly 7 months after his release, and many of those were later wrongly attributed to Jerry Frank Townsend, who was arrested in September of 1979. In December 1979, Susan Boynton, 21, was suspected of being one of Mosley's victims. In February 22nd, 1980, Arnett Tukes, 19, was raped and strangled and strongly linked to Mosley. Then on March 16th, 1980, Gloria Irving, 16, was suspected of being strangled in a case tied to Mosley. On April 20th, 1980, Mosley was arrested for attempted rape. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years, but later paroled after appeal, serving roughly 3.5 years total. On December 24th, 1983, Emma Cook, 54, was raped and murdered. Mosley later confessed, and DNA supported that connection. In 1984, Geraldine Barfield, 36, was raped and murdered and suspected to be another Mosley victim. Also in 1984, Loretta Young Brown, 29, was raped and murdered, and DNA confirmed Mosley's involvement. And then we get to April 1985. Chandra Whitehead, 8, was raped and beaten to death in her home. And this is the murder that led to Frank Lee Smith's wrongful conviction. In 1987, Teresa Giles was raped and murdered, and Mosley later confessed. Now we get to February 24th, 1987. Centrail Love, 24, was raped and strangled and suspected in connection with Mosley. Now, they let this motherfucker out multiple times. I just can't understand it. It's fucking disturbing. Anyway, on May 17th, 1987, Mosley was arrested for theft. Blood and semen evidence, along with confessions, linked him to multiple murders. He was charged in some killings, including Emma Cook and Teresa Giles, but he was ruled incompetent to stand trial because of his low IQ, reported around 51, and also his mental health issues. He was committed to psychiatric facilities for life. He was not sent to prison because of his low IQ and mental capacity. His IQ was 51. Jerry Frank Townsend had an IQ of around 58, and he had the mental capacity of an 8-year-old. He still went to fucking prison, so make that one make sense. Anyway, back to this. This timeline matters because it shows something terrifying. While innocent men were being convicted, Mosley's violence was not just a rumor. It was a long, repeated pattern that spread across years. Before we move on, something a little lighter, check out my t-shirt store and grab one. Make someone laugh and start a conversation. That's gigglesongarment.printify.me. Sales help my show grow and will help me add more content to the episodes. Now back to today's case. These convictions didn't happen because of one simple mistake. They happened because of multiple failures that all pushed in the same wrong direction. In Frank Lee Smith's case, the prosecution leaned heavily on testimony, and the case against him lacked the kind of physical evidence that should have made everyone slow down. Once he was identified as the suspect, the rest of the case seems to have hardened around that assumption. In Jerry Frank Townsend's case, his intellectual disability made him especially vulnerable. That should have triggered caution. Instead, it made him an easy target looking for a quick answer. You know, the problem, it wasn't just bad luck, it was tunnel vision. And once tunnel vision takes over a murder investigation, innocent people end up carrying the weight of crimes that they never committed. DNA changed everything. It gave investigators a way to revisit the evidence and compare it against the men who had already been convicted. And once that happened, the story collapsed. Frank Lee Smith wasn't the killer. Jerry Frank Townsend wasn't the killer. The evidence instead pointed back to Eddie Lee Mosley. That's what makes these cases so extremely devastating. You know, the truth was there the whole time. It was hidden inside the evidence, but it took years. And in Frank Smith's case, it took his death before the system was forced to face it. The story is so much bigger than, two wrongful convictions. It's about what happens when the justice system wants an answer so badly that it just stops asking the right questions. And it's also about a violent predator whose crimes stretched across years, while two innocent men were forced to carry the blame. And it's also about the just terrible, horrible cost of getting it wrong. Townsend, he confessed, but the problem is that the confession came from a man with the mental capacity of a child, making it just, if nothing else, deeply suspect. Smith, on the other hand, didn't give some big open confession, but police used pressure and deception to get an incriminating statement that was later treated as involuntary. In both cases, the system treated shaky statements like solid proof. Frank Lee Smith died before he was cleared. Jerry Frank Townsend, he lost more than 20 years of his life. And Eddie Lee Mosley, a man later tied to a horrifying string of rapes and murders, was eventually arrested, institutionalized, and never fully tried in the ordinary way because of his mental condition. That remained the hidden force behind too many of these cases. Mosley died in 2020 while serving a life sentence, but the available reporting I found here doesn't spell out a specific cause of death. In cases like this, the question is never just who gets convicted. The real question is, why were so many lives allowed to be taken while the real killer stayed in the shadows? Guys, that's all I have for this case today. I'm Tim, and this has been True Crime Unchained, coming to you from Southwest Florida. Peace.